Hello, everyone. This is Alexander Horat with the Free American Press. Today, we are having a very special guest on the show named George Gammon. He is the leader of the Rebel Capitalist Show. Thank you for being on the show, George.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, cool. Can you tell us the biggest problems facing America?
Wow, that's a broad question. I think right now you've got to look at the economy because you can look at social unrest. You can look at the rioting, the looting, the divisiveness politically. But I think that all goes back to economic fundamental issues. So the way a healthy economy works is it revolves around the production of goods and services and creating those goods and services more efficiently over time. One of the things, or one of the examples I use in a lot of my videos is a very simple economy where you've got someone who is raising cattle, another person raising or growing cotton and corn, let's say. And that's what the individuals in this society need to sustain themselves. Well, if these groups, these farmers, these ranchers can produce more than they consume, then that provides goods for the rest of society so they don't have to grow those cattle, that corn to eat. They don't have to grow cotton to make clothing. They can just buy it from this other person with the excess productivity that they have doing whatever it is that they're doing. Let's say they're a teacher, they're a doctor, they're they run the local grocery store or something like that. If it wasn't for the first group producing more than they consume, the rest of it would not be possible. You see, and that's how you go from living in a very agriculture-based society to a society that we have today, where the standard of living, the life expectancy, et cetera, is far higher. So you've got to start with that premise. And in that society, what is the measurement of wealth? Well, the measurement of wealth would be the goods and services that the society at large is producing efficiently. Because whether that society had $1 million revolving around, or it had 10 million or 100 million, it doesn't really change the amount of wealth that's in the society, because it's all, again, it goes back to that production of goods and services. So once we understand that that's our starting point and the foundation of a structurally healthy economy, then we can juxtapose that to what we have today and start to highlight some of the issues. Well, today in the United States, we don't really produce much of anything as far as the goods. If you go down to your local Walmart or Target or Home Depot, the majority of the products that you see for sale will be made somewhere other than the United States. And we export a few of our services, but not that much. So the majority of the United States is a domestic service-based economy. So the problem with that is it's a huge dependency on foreigners to supply the stuff that we use in our daily lives. Okay. So then what happens is people go out there, they're creating all these service-based domestic businesses, and they try to figure out a way to get ahead, or at least they try to figure out a way to increase their purchasing power. Well, along comes the Fed and says, I know, we'll do something called inflation targeting. So ever since 1913, let's say, we're going to try to create a 2 or 3% inflation. So said another way, we want to try to make the population at large poorer by 2 to 3% per year compounded, right? As far as if they're just saving their money. So what this forces people to do that are producing more than they consume is to take their excess productivity in the form of dollars and put it into some sort of asset class where they can get a return that either matches or exceeds the rate of inflation. So they're not constantly becoming poorer. They're not decreasing their purchasing power. So what do? they go into the stock market, they go into bonds, they go into real estate, they go into all of these assets, then what happens is these assets grow and grow and grow. And then we get these asset bubbles when the Fed compounds their artificially low interest rates and the inflation that they get, that they produce by expanding the money supply. They compound this with quantitative easing. And now what we see is the government compounding it even further with stimulus and stimulus checks. So what ends up happening is the financial economy expands, but the real economy contracts. And you get to this point where the tail is wagging the dog. In one of my recent videos, I used the example of a hot air balloon, right? We've all seen those big balloons, and underneath you've got that little teeny basket, right? The large balloon should be the real economy, and the little basket should be the stock market. The stock market should just go up or down, but it should go with the real economy. That's our main focus. But now what we have is the financial economy is the hot air balloon, and the real economy is the little basket. So if the financial economy goes down, so does the real economy. And that's not the way it should work. Another example I'd give you is a smaller, maybe emerging market economy like Colombia in South America. If the stock market in Colombia went down by 50%, no one would even know. No one has stock. They don't care. The economy isn't built around the stock market. But of course, here in the United States, if the stock market went down by 50%, trust me, everyone would know about it, and it would dramatically affect consumption. Therefore, the real economy, because our economy is 70% consumption, going back to that process that we have of just circulating those domestic services and importing our goods from other countries, which is why we have that huge trade deficit. So what that leads to is the people that own the assets, their standard of living improves, their purchasing power increases. But the people that don't own the assets, well, they get screwed. They're left behind because all they're making is a wage that really doesn't keep up with the pace of inflation. And because asset prices increase so dramatically, those people that are left out in the cold, well, they can't afford to get into the game. Yeah. So what happens is the wealth gap continues to increase and increase, which is when you get social unrest, civil unrest, rioting, looting, etc. And it takes us into the fourth turning, if you've heard that term, the book by Neil Howe, where this usually ends badly. Now, I'm not saying that it has to now, but if history teaches us anything, you should have a plan B right now, is basically what I'm saying. So I think that's the main problem that we're dealing with right now. And another issue, a kind of a fringe issue or side effect, unintended consequence, is the dollar is going to be the release valve in that equation, because the government has to continually create more currency and do more stimulus, because it's like a heroin addict. And we saw this with quantitative easing, right? You're a young guy. I don't know if you remember when Bernanke came out with quantitative easing, but they didn't call it QE1. They just called it QE. Well, why is that? Because it's supposed to only happen one time, right? But then we get QE2, then we get QE3, then we get whatever you do, don't call it QE. Remember when Powell was saying that? And now we have QE infinity. And they can't pull back the QE. They can't do quantitative tightening for very long, or the market freaks out and plummets. Why? Because we've built the financial economy around quantitative easing, and then we built the real economy around the financial economy. But now I think we've taken it a step further, and the entire system is not only contingent upon ever increasing amounts of quantitative easing, but it's also contingent upon ever increasing amounts of government stimulus, because it is like a heroin addict. Like I was saying before, that heroin addict, you need more and more and more of the drug to have the exact same effect. So if the Fed has to continually create all of these bank reserves, or more and more bank reserves, if their balance sheet has to grow almost exponentially. And then the government has to do the exact same thing with their spending to kick the can further down the road. Then at some point, the dollar gets pretty darn weak. And I think that's why you've seen it go from, call it 100 to 90 on the DXY right now. So that kind of sums up my 30,000 foot worldview of the dollar and the United States and some of the issues we have.
Yeah, what you said definitely seems to be right. So how can we solve these problems in America?
Well, unfortunately, there's no easy way out. Again, let's go back to the example of the heroin addict. How do you solve that problem? Well, unfortunately, the only way you can solve the problem and get that person healthy again is if you take away the drug. But if you take away the drug, there's going to be some extreme consequences. They're going to go through massive withdrawals, and they're going to suffer through a significant amount of pain. And that's the only way to get them healthy again, to where they can start leading a normal life. And it's the same thing with the economy right now. We've got to get all of the distortions, the malinvestment, the misallocation of resources, the excessive debts. We've got to flush that out of the system before we can go ahead and start growing again in a fundamentally sound way that's sustainable. And now that can happen as a result of an inflationary kind of deleveraging, and it can also happen with a deflationary deleveraging. And I don't know which we're going to get. I would lean more on the side of the inflationary deleveraging, but only time will tell.
Yeah, so one thing that you were talking about, you were saying how America is no longer a producer country, it's a consumer country. So what is a good way to bring back American industry?
First and foremost, you've got to decrease regulations. You've got to decrease regulation. You've got to decrease taxes. You've just got to be more competitive, right? I mean, if you ask yourself, if you own a business and you have 1,000 employees and you're thinking of moving your business to Ireland or anywhere overseas, why? Why would you consider doing that? Well, most likely because you're going to be able to get some sort of cost advantage. You're probably going to get lower taxes, and the overall business environment is going to be far more friendly there than it is here. Or why would you move? You see, it's the states compete with one another for businesses. Like Texas is competing with California, and we see who's winning that. But countries compete with one another as well, and this is good. This is what we want. This is something that we should look at as a win for the free market, because if we have these countries competing, then it keeps them in check, and it's the constraint, it's the check and balance. And the worst thing, in my opinion, is if we somehow created some regulations or restrictions where these businesses could not leave, or they could not go where they are treated best, to coin a phrase from my good buddy Andrew Henderson. So that's what you just have to, I think to answer your question, you just have to ask yourself, okay, what is Texas doing or not doing that California is doing? Like, what is the difference there? And then whatever those differences are, that will bring you to your answer as to what we need to do to bring manufacturing back to the United States on a large scale. Because we've got the good news is we've got the capital. We got very cheap capital, that's for sure. And we do have a lot of human capital. We've got a lot of very talented people that can be extremely productive. But you've just got to get the government out of the way. And you've got to get right now we've got this narrative where the people who produce, the entrepreneurs and the business owners, they've got a huge target on their back, not only from the politicians, but also from the media. Listen, why would you want to go out there and work your tail off 80 hours a week, risk your life savings, just to have the media and the politician tell you that you're the Antichrist constantly? And then you have to give them especially if you live in California, you got to give them 60 cents on the dollar. But who's going to do that?
Yeah.
Nobody. They're going to try to get out of that system. And so I think that the politicians, that they'll never do this because they're in it for power. They're not in it for the good of society. But if they were in it for the good of society, they would realize that the government in and of itself can't do anything. They always say, well, we're taking bold action. No, you're not. You're not. You can't do anything. The only thing you can do is to create an environment where individuals in the real economy, people like you, people like your viewers, can go out and pursue their own self-interest and produce goods and services. The only thing the government can do is create that structure and maintain it, that foundation. And if they continually change the rules of the game, move the goalpost, if you will, and then they continually bash those people that they should try to support, you're only going to have the government just continually get in the way. And at some point, you end up with this system now where we're literally paying people to not produce, to stay home. Therefore, the amount of goods and services that we create goes down. And if you use my definition of that being the measurement of wealth, by definition, with all these stimulus checks going out and a structurally high unemployment rate, we are getting poorer. We're definitely not getting richer as a result of additional currency units being sent in the mail to most Americans.
Yeah, I definitely think you're right. We definitely need to lower taxes for businesses. I think that's really important. And one thing, I was talking to a really good friend of mine, and I'm going to ask you what you think of this. So he was telling me how Germany actually, unlike the United States has lost most of its industrial base. But we see Germany, though, they have kept most of their industry. They still make all the parts of their tank. We actually import tanks from Germany into the US. So what he was telling me is the reason why is because they've had tariffs to protect their industry, because Germany, unfortunately, cannot have, really cheap labor like China has, which, has slave labor in some cases. So what are your thoughts on tariffs and bringing back American industry?
Well, you have to start by understanding the premise that there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. See? So I would ask your friend, okay, the perceived benefit is that you've maintained your manufacturing base. What's the cost? That's what most people forget. Yeah. They like to focus on one or the other. But in every equation, there is both. The question is to what degree, right? So the cost there, and I haven't studied the German economy, so I'm by no means an expert, but my guess would be if you have those tariffs, then you're going to have higher prices for the consumers. So, okay, you may have a larger manufacturing base, and there are benefits to that. But at the same time, the everyday consumer, the poor people, the middle class, are paying higher prices than they otherwise would for the items they buy daily. So on net balance, is that a benefit? I don't know. I think that the best way to go about it would be to open up a system that had more free trade, and to where you let the countries compete with one another. You let a manufacturing plant in Germany compete directly with a manufacturing plant in the United States or in Mexico or something like that. And whoever can produce the best good at the lowest price, determined by the market, determined by the individuals who are willing to buy that good because they want it more than the money in their pocket, that's going to tell you who's doing the best job. And I would be more inclined to try to go that direction. Now, if you were to ask me, okay, George, if we have to make a choice between tariffs and an income tax, okay, I mean, again, I think we need to do a good cost benefit analysis there. And in that equation, I might say that there's probably a better benefit to keeping the tariffs and eliminating the income tax, right? It'd be the same thing for a sales tax. Anything that's more consumption driven, I think would be, although I don't like taxes, I think it would be more prudent, and it would create a far different incentive structure than income taxes. So, but my main point there is people have to understand that when you're dealing with economics, which is the study of limited resources, scarce resources with alternative uses, you have to understand that there are no solutions. There are none. There are never any solutions. There are only trade-offs. Another great example would be your time. That's a limited resource or a scarce resource with alternative uses. You could be taking this 45 minutes and you could be doing something else, right? You could be spending time with your family. You could be spending time with your friend, but instead you're here and you're wanting to do this show. So there's a trade-off there. There's a cost benefit analysis, and you've come to the conclusion that your time is better spent in this interview right now than it would be hanging out with some of your buddies. So you see, you can't really get away from it, and it affects everything. But yet so few people go through life thinking in those terms, especially when they're trying to understand economic consequences, or they're making political decisions.
Yeah, there definitely always is some trade-offs. Like if you look at early American history, they didn't have income tax. They only had a tariff to fund the whole government. So it is interesting, you know, how you could do it. So my next question has been playing on my mind, and you as well, because so why is a small group of bankers allowed to control the direction of the world?
Because they control the dollar.
Okay.
So the dollar is the world reserve currency, right? You know that. And back in 1944, we had something called Bretton Woods. And Bretton Woods said that, okay, the United States, you've got all the gold. So we're going to go ahead and peg the dollar to gold. And then all these other countries can peg their currency to the dollar. So we have this de facto gold standard, if you will. The problem was Triffin's dilemma. And this is basically the idea that in order for, if the whole globe is going to use dollars, if that's the global reserve currency, then in order to grow at its maximum capacity, the global economy outside of the US domestic economy is going to need a substantial amount of dollars. Okay, well, where are they going to get the dollars? Well, they get the dollars by the United States running a trade deficit, right? Because what is a trade deficit? That's where we are saying, hey, we want to import all of these goods from China that we can buy at Walmart, and we're going to trade you these green pieces of paper for them. So if we have $100 billion trade deficit, that means that we've got $100 billion on net balance that are going out into the global economy and circulating. Okay. The problem is if we don't run a large enough trade deficit, that's number one. And number two, the problem for the United States is by running these decade-long trade deficits that are now growing significantly, it does what? It hollows out our manufacturing base. Okay. But going back to, let's say, the 1950s or so, they realized that the United States couldn't really supply the world with enough dollars. So they started to kind of scratch their head and like, how are we going to figure this problem out? And Milton Friedman was one of those individuals. And then they noticed that the free market was doing it for them. And this free market was something called the Eurodollar system. So what happened is there were dollar deposits that obviously got outside of the United States. So think of someone taking $100 million and depositing it with Deutsche Bank in Germany, okay, or HSBC or something like that. Well, now that dollar-denominated deposit or bank liability is outside the United States system, okay. Well, that bank can use those dollars as basically a backstop. So I don't want to say they lend those dollars out, because in reality, they don't really lend those actual dollars out. They
Right.
just use them to back up additional dollar-based loans. Okay. So what ended up happening are the foreign banks started to create all of these dollar-denominated loans to facilitate the global growth we were talking about, so that they could run on all 8 cylinders. So you had the economists, even at the Fed during the late 1960s and 1970s, understand that we have this Eurodollar system, and they chose to take on a policy of benign neglect. So we'll just kind of pretend it doesn't really exist and it's off in the shadows. We really can't control it. So we'll just kind of ignore it. And then what happens, we'll just focus on our domestic policy and keeping, managing interest rates here. And we'll assume that whatever we do domestically is just going to have a trickle through effect with the Eurodollar system over the whole globe.
Right.
Fast forward to, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, so basically the bankers control where the money trickles down to, right?
To a certain extent, yeah. But we fast forward to 2000, and the Fed now knows, in my opinion, that they don't control the dollar. The United States doesn't control the dollar. The government doesn't control it. The bankers control the dollar. It's not Jerome Powell, it's Jamie Dimon. Because the commercial banks now, inside and outside of the United States, create far more dollars by issuing new loans than the Fed can do just by creating bank reserves. Now, it's a little different when they're monetizing the debt that the government is spending, but I don't want to go off on a big tangent. The main takeaway is that the banksters are really in control over creating additional dollar supply. It's not the Fed. Therefore, if they need additional dollars to create the inflation they need to bail out the government, then the only game in town is Jamie Dimon. It's not Jerome Powell.
Right. So basically, when Americans gave up, our right to make our own money with gold and silver and gave it to the bankers who could use the printing press, they basically gave control of the country to the bankers. Right.
Basically, yeah. I mean, that's once you get on that slippery slope, that's kind of where you end up. Now, I want to add, though, because people kind of demonize fractional reserve banking. It's not really the fractional reserve banking that was the issue. It was getting the government involved in a central agency called the Fed. Because if you go back to, the Fed was actually the third central bank we had. And originally, Alexander Hamilton wanted the first central bank to actually provide lending to the real economy, which it did, in addition to the government. But after 1836, we kind of had enough with the central banks. That was the end of the second one. And then from 1836 to the beginning of the Civil War, and in between there, prior to 1836, we had something called free banking. So this is when you take your gold, you give it to the local bank, and they just give you a checking deposit based on the gold, or they give you checks that you can write, and then they can issue loans based on creating additional of banknotes of that individual bank that they either give to you or create a checking account for. So they're increasing the money supply. That gold is the base money, but they're increasing the broad money, a lot of times with their own actual currency notes from each individual bank. So you go to and get a loan from Bank of America, and they literally give you Bank of America dollars. Right. This is the way it was with that free banking system that we had in the United States, which my point is was a product of the free market, and it was fractional reserve. The problem started to come in when it was nationalized during the Civil War. And then, to your point, the big problem came when we instituted the Fed in 1913. And then we really had this national system that we centralized even further. And that's when the problems really began. But fractional reserve banking in and of itself, without the government, in my opinion, really isn't an issue.
Mhm. So, what are some things Americans can do to take back control of their nation from the bankers?
I don't know that they can. I mean, you could say Bitcoin. I mean, you can say Bitcoin, you can say gold, try to operate outside of the system, but that's almost impossible for the average Joe and Jane. I think what a more prudent strategy would be is to prepare for certain outcomes that have a high degree of probability, a high probability of coming to fruition. So as an example, you've got to have the system clear out. So either we have a deflationary deleveraging or an inflationary deleveraging. Educate yourself to determine what you think the highest probable outcome is. And let's say that's inflation. Okay, well, go ahead and set yourself up to make sure that you've got a hedge. So if we do see significant inflation over the next 10 years, you're going to at least maintain your purchasing power, right? Number two, we know that there's most likely, and I hope there's not, I'm not saying this is a certainty, but there's most likely going to be increasing amounts of social unrest. So if you live in an urban area, I think it would be prudent to have just a very simple plan B. And I always say, just, why not have an RV in your driveway? They're cheap, load it with food. You can just, if you don't like what's going on in your urban area, there's riots like we saw in 2020. You can just get in the RV, go up to the mountains for a couple days, chill out, and just watch it from a distance. I don't think there's any downside to that whatsoever. And then for parents with kids and small kids, I think they've got to look at the education system and have an honest discussion with themselves as far as if they like the direction the education system is going and if they want their kids to be a part of that. And that takes on, I know, a bunch of different dynamics. But I think people just need to, I don't want people to lose sleep over this and stress out, but I think people need to be cognizant of it so they can make smart, rational decisions today. So whatever happens in the future, when we have this reset, if you want to call it that, that they'll be prepared and they'll, get through it, and they'll at least maintain their current level of purchasing power and standard of living.
So we're starting to see a movement across the United States, with many states recognizing gold as legal tender. We're seeing that getting passed in various states. So do you think we can break the bank by going back to gold and silver by using that as a medium of exchange?
Theoretically, yes. You just got to ask yourself, how does lending work? That's the big question, because you could say the same thing with Bitcoin. But Bitcoin right now, and I'm not saying it's going to be like this forever, but in its current state, it would be very difficult to borrow or lend in Bitcoin. And I know there's some companies that do it for short term, but I'm talking like a 30-year mortgage. Like, you've got to put yourself in the position of someone, or of someone that owns gold. Like, I'm sounds like you own gold. You own gold. If I said, hey, I want to borrow $100,000 of your gold so I can buy a house, and I want to borrow it for 30 years, what interest rate would you need?
Couldn't we go back to the interest rates that were pre Federal Reserve?
Well, but that's not going to cut it if you're someone that believes that we're going to have significant amounts of inflation because the Fed devaluing the dollar by printing all these currency units. Because if you're someone that believes that the price of gold, as an example, is going to go from $2,000 an ounce to call it $10,000 an ounce over the next 5 years, you're not going to lend that money out unless it's at a
well, that's how you solve the problem. Then you have your interest in gold as well. You don't have your interest in dollars. What do you think of
right.
that?
But then who's going to pay that? Who's going to borrow? So you put yourself in, if you're a borrower and you think that gold is going from $2,000 an ounce to 10,000, when you have to pay that $100,000 worth of gold back, it requires far more dollars to do that. So you're not going to want to take that bet unless you're getting like some sort of negative interest rate, but then you're not going to be willing to lend. So you have this kind of, you got kind of like a Mexican standoff, for lack of a better term. Now, I'm not saying it wouldn't be a better system. It would. What I am saying is that getting from A to B is tough. It's very tough because of the system that we have now, the debt-based monetary system. Going from that to sound money with little or no government involvement there'd be a lot of Americans where their standard of living would decrease substantially. Now, I'm not saying that's not the best route. I'm just saying that, again, if our economy right now is addicted to heroin. So if we want to get back on to healthy footing through using gold or Bitcoin, something like that, we're going to have to go through those monetary withdrawals.
So you were saying you were thinking gold could go up to $10,000 an ounce. So a big question that's been playing on my mind and many other people's minds is, do you think there's going to be hyperinflation for everyday goods and services as well, basically for everything? Or do you think that inflation will be steady at 2% each year?
Well, there's a lot of wiggle room in that question because, how do you define hyperinflation? I would assume that you're probably talking about 50% plus per year. And there's a big difference between 50% and 2%. But yeah, I mean, I think it's possible. If the system stays the way it is, I don't know that it's possible. I would attach the probability of hyperinflation to be that would be a very low probability event. I think 1970s is far more likely. That said, if the system changes, then all bets are off. Then I would switch and I would immediately go to the side of, you know what, over the next 5 to 10 years, it's more likely that we're going to get that 50% plus print. So what am I talking about? How would the system need to change? Well, let's go back to what we were saying about the commercial banks being the creators of new dollars or new currency units. And again, I'm excluding the fact right now that the government is spending money and the Fed is monetizing it. That's a completely different topic of discussion. Let's just go back a few years the way it normally works. Well, in order for hyperinflation to kick in, you would have to have a massive increase in the amount of currency units that are chasing goods and services in the United States. That, or you'd have to have some huge influx of dollars from foreigners coming in and buying U.S. assets. It may happen, but again, likelihood is very low. So how would you, especially if these banks are constricted by their P&L, meaning their profit and loss? A bank isn't going to issue a loan unless they can just flip the paper to the Fed. They're not going to issue a loan if they think you can't pay it back, because that they go bust. They can't have negative equity. They're insolvent. So that's their constraint, is they need good borrowers to lend to that can actually pay back the loan. Well, if all the consumers and all the businesses in the economy are leveraged up to the hilt, well, how can you create more dollars? It makes it very difficult. So, but that's not to say that we can't get 1970s type inflation. But how would the system change? If we go to a central bank digital currency, let's say, then you, me, everyone watching this video right now, they all would have an account with the Fed. maybe in addition to Bank of America or Wells Fargo or Chase, or whatever, but you'd have an account with the Fed. So would every single business, the local Walmart, the grocery store, or the nail salon on the corner, the gas station. We would all have accounts with the Fed. If we all have accounts with the Fed, you get into this environment where they could, to coin a phrase from Dr. Lacey Hunt, they could turn bank reserves into legal tender. You see, right now, the only thing the Fed can do is create more bank reserves to buy assets from the bank. But then it's still up to the banking system to create more currency units in the real economy, right? There's that other party involved. But if we all have an account with the Fed, essentially the Fed could lend to you directly. They could lend to business XYZ directly, creating more currency units. Now, why that's different than the commercial banking system doing it is because the Fed isn't constrained by a P&L. They're not constrained by a balance sheet. You see, if you don't pay them back, does it matter if the Fed's insolvent? I don't know. So my point is they can start issuing massive amounts of loans to whomever can fog a mirror in order to create enough currency units to continually inflate those asset bubbles that we need, and to give the government the inflation it needs to lower their debt to GDP. Now, there's no free lunch. So what most likely would happen in that event is you'd have Gresham's law kick in, meaning the bad money chasing out the good money. So all the people, see, inflation is very psychological. So at some point, most likely the society would see this happening and be like, wait a minute, I don't want these dollars anymore. I want anything but dollars. I want to buy this computer. I want to buy oil. I want to buy more cars. I want to just something that's tangible that I know is going to have value in the future, compared to just these pieces of paper that I can see now they're just printing to infinity. Gresham's law kicks in. That's when you could potentially get that inflation genie out of the bottle. And because the Fed had created so many currency units through all of its lending into the economy directly to try to stoke inflation in the first place, then it runs rampant and you go from 10 to 20 to maybe 50% per year. So that's a long-winded answer, but the bottom line is, if the system stays as it is, then I think the end game, if you will, is 1970s. And I'm not saying that's going to happen in the next year or the next 2 years, but 3-5 years out, it may happen that quickly. But there's a lot of deflationary pressures as well that people need to be cognizant of. You got to think about it this way. If we just lived within the system we're in right now and the Fed stopped QE and the government stopped the stimulus checks and the infrastructure spending or the stimulus packages, what would happen? Well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that. That's right. The asset markets would crash. Interest rates would go up. Housing market crash. The economy would completely deflate. Now, I don't know how much consumer prices would come down, but you would have a massive deflation in assets. So we know that left to its own devices, if we just had a free market system without any of this central planning, it would deflate. So then I think if it stays the same, but yet we have massive amounts of government spending, kind of what we see, bigger and bigger stimulus packages, then you have this hybrid system where the most likely outcome is stagflation, i.e. 1970s. And then if the system changes, which is option number 3, where we all, they ban cash, we have a central bank digital currency, the Fed starts turning these bank reserves into legal tender and issuing loans directly to the public, I think then we could possibly go into a quote unquote hyperinflation.
So one thing that you mentioned that sounded pretty scary is that you think that everybody may have a Fed account, a Federal Reserve account online. So that actually brings me to my next question. What do you think of the social credit system they are trying to implement?
Well, I think again, there are no certainties. There are only probabilities. But I think the probability is, especially if we continue to get administrations that are more and more extreme on the left. And I'm a libertarian. I dislike the right just as much as the left. But the bottom line is, if you keep getting these administrations that just need to one up each other on their virtue signaling, it is likely that we get to a point, especially if we have a central bank digital currency, where loans, or at least the interest rate, is not really predicated upon your credit score or your ability to pay the loan back, but it's predicated upon how good you are, and how much you've benefited society, and how much you care about the greater good, right? And if you go into that grocery store without wearing a mask, well, they're going to get that on the facial recognition camera. That's going to give you one check mark. Oh, you had a 10, but now you got a 9. So the next time you go to the Fed on your hands and knees and beg for a mortgage, you're going to have to pay a 6% interest rate instead of a 5% interest rate. So next time you go to that grocery store, you better wear your mask. And then next month, if you buy a little bit too much alcohol, and we don't think you should be buying that, or maybe, instead of using 100 gallons of gas, you use 120 gallons of gas, therefore you're polluting the environment, and we can't have that. And therefore we're going to knock your social score down to 8. And if it gets down to a 5, then you can't even get a loan at all. Very similar to a credit score. It's just what makes it go up or down is drastically different.
Right. Yeah, that definitely sounds really scary. So why does a corporate union, the LBMA, based in London, get to set the price of gold each day?
Well, what are you referring to specifically?
The LBMA, I'm just asking you why they get to set the price of gold and silver each day.
Well, I don't know that they get to set the actual price, because if you're going to buy gold from, let's say, my buddy Peter Schiff as an example, he's going to charge you basically whatever he has to pay for it with a spread.
Right.
And then that's based on his supply and how, let's say he's getting it from the Perth Mint or something. I don't think that he does, but let's just say that he's buying it wholesale from the Perth Mint. Well, how are they getting it? How much is being produced by the gold miners? So I think it's more of a supply and demand when you're looking at it on the retail level. Now, as far as with futures
price.
contracts, and as far as the paper spot. So the futures contracts is what you're talking about. So that's really based on supply and demand of futures contracts themselves, and not really gold or silver. And that's where a lot of people get frustrated, because there can be such a delta and such a difference on the price. And I acknowledge that, but I think I've actually tried to think through this quite extensively in the past. And I do believe that there's always going to be manipulation in those markets, but I don't think there can be long-term manipulation, because I think the market at the end of the day is more powerful, because they can always choose to exercise the right to get a delivery on the future contract for physical gold. You see, and if if the delta gets too high one way or the other, they're going to start, they're not going to just be trading those futures contracts back and forth. One party is going to want to take delivery, or something's going to happen there. If it gets skewed too highly, then it's going to kind of meet an equilibrium point. So I'm not saying that there's not manipulation in the price. I 100% think there is, but I don't know that it moves the price that much from today to tomorrow, or from 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock. I think, well, it might, excuse me, I said that the wrong way. It might move the price from 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock. It might move the price from today or tomorrow, but over the next 6 months, I don't know that it moves the price that much.
Yeah, the LBMA does the spot price, I believe. They set the spot price of gold and silver each day. So switching gears a little bit, what are your thoughts on the 15% global corporate income tax the United States wants to implement?
This goes right back to what we were saying. We want the states and the countries to compete with one another, and that's how they're going to improve, right? Why is the government so inefficient? It's because of the incentive structure. They're not motivated by profit and loss. In fact, to the contrary, a lot of times they are motivated by loss, in the sense that the government gives each agency a specific budget. So let's say the budget for XYZ agency is $10 million this year. Well, if there's one day left in the year and they've only spent $9 million, what are they going to do that last year or that last day? They're going to go out and get a bunch of hookers and coke, and they're going to try to rent a yacht. They're going to do everything they can to spend that $1 million in one day. Why? Because if they only spend 9 million, then the next year their budget is going to be lower, and they might have to lay some people off. They might have to reduce hours. They can't fund all these pet projects that they have. So you see, the perverse incentive structure there is one of the reasons, one of the many reasons, why the government is so wasteful and so incredibly inefficient, right? So what we want is to create a system where the states and the countries are actually competing. They have an incentive to be more efficient. They have an incentive to do better, right? And that's where global taxes come in. So basically what Janet Yellen and the Treasury are saying is the United States is so bloated with bureaucracy that we don't want to compete with the rest of the world for business. We don't want to get better. We just want to make the rest of the world worse. That's basically what they're saying. They're basically someone who, let's say you weigh 300 pounds, and instead of trying to lose weight and become healthy, you go on this campaign that everyone should just start eating more and go up to 350 pounds. So relative to them, you look skinny.
So do you think
that's basically what Janet Yellen is saying right now? So, but what does that do to the average person? Let's just say that they were to implement a 15% global corporate tax. Well, and keep in mind, in her statement from the Treasury, they said that they want that to go a lot higher in the future. They just said that this is a good starting point. Okay, well, where do taxes come from that are paid? Well, they come from profits. All right, well, what would a corporation do with the profit if they don't give it to the government? Well, they'd most likely distribute it through dividends, or they would use it to grow their company or buy their share back. And I know it's buying their shares back can be not such a great idea overall, but it increases the share price. Well, who are the shareholders? Most of the shareholders are these huge pension funds, such as CalPERS. And who are the people who are receiving a pension from CalPERS? That would be the teachers' unions. That would be the firefighters. That would be the police department. That would be all of these people that the government supposedly, and Janet Yellen, is trying to protect by increasing taxes. But the unintended consequence is they actually hurt the people they're trying to help. Right? As well as reduce the amount of goods and services created. See, again, it goes back to that first thing that I was saying. Whenever you try to think through any of this stuff that seems very complex, all you have to ask yourself is, does it create fewer goods and services or more goods and services? So let's just say that Janet Yellen institutes a 40% global corporate tax. Are we going to have more goods and services or fewer? The answer is obviously fewer. Therefore, as a global society, as the human race, by definition, we will be poorer as a result.
Yeah, definitely. So will Janet Yellen succeed in instituting this global tax, you think?
I don't know if she gets a global tax. I think that, I don't know. you could have something like a global civil war type thing. I guess that would be a world war, but I don't know that it would be a shooting war, more of like a Cold War where you've got a group of countries that just say, listen, we understand what these global elite are all about, and we don't want to play ball. We want nothing to do with this nonsense. We're going to go off and create our own trade agreements, and we're going to do our own thing. And then all of the Western democracies, they just, kind of join hands in this tax the rich kumbaya, and they kind of go down that path. And what I'm talking about is Western Europe. I'm talking about the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, most likely. And but there's, that push for central planning and everything that goes along with it. It really doesn't fit the direction that certain countries are going, such as Brazil, such as Russia, such as the Middle East. So I think that's a tough sell for to envision a world where Russia, where Putin is going along with whatever Janet Yellen wants as far as a tax proposal.
Wow.
I don't see that happening.
So do you think?
But I do think the Western countries, though, that join hands and try to institute this corporate tax are also going to institute an income tax as well.
So do you think this global corporate tax, what she's trying to do may cause some sort of world war? Say if, Russia doesn't want to join in it and the United States says it has to or something?
Boy, I sure hope not. But I mean, if history is any guide, then yeah, I mean, you could see that. But I would hope that it would be more of a Cold War, and that we're just, you do what you want to do. We're going to go do what we want to do, and just leave us the hell alone. And this kind of the don't tread on me type of policy. Hopefully it would result in that, but who knows?
Yeah, definitely. Could you tell the viewer where they can find you?
Sure, they can go to my YouTube channel, which is George Gammon, Gammon, or they can just Google that. They go to my website, pull me up on Twitter. I've got another YouTube channel called Rebel Capitalist, and it's going to have all my content right there. I'm very easy to find online.
Well, that's great. Everyone, please check out George's site. And thank you for doing this video. George, thank you for being on the show.
No problem, man. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Thank you for the viewers who are watching. God bless.